OK, first of all, can I just begin by thanking the organisers for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honour to be here. The theme I've given myself to speak to is, what would justice mean for Blair Peach? You've heard earlier, someone spoke very movingly in the early session, said that as far as the organisers of Southall Resist 40 are concerned, Blair Peach is unfinished business. So what I want to talk about is just what would that process look like of obtaining justice for Blair Peach. I'll start and I'll speak for about 4 minutes about what happened with his death. I know there'll be many people from the room with that, who are familiar with that, but there'll also be people who don't know the story. So I will start with the events of his death, but then, as I say, my main part will be thinking about the process of obtaining justice. So, St George's Day, 23rd of April 1979, 40 years ago this week, Blair Peach was killed during the protests in Southall. He was killed because, in essence, because the National Front were holding an election meeting in Southall, and the police, faced with very significant protests against that meeting, made a decision, took a choice, and that choice was to prioritise the 30 or so people who made it into that election meeting over the thousands of people who demonstrated outside, who signed petitions in advance, who went on strike in a number of workplaces, but the thousands of people who said they didn't want that meeting to go ahead. And the police chose to prioritise the rights of the 30 people who wanted the meeting to go ahead. Something like 5,000 police officers were on duty that day, which I think was almost 100% of the operational strength of the Metropolitan Police at the time. In other words, large numbers of police had to be drafted from outside London in order to make that event go ahead. What happened on the day is that the election meeting was taking place in Town Hall. The people coming into it, the 30 of them were on a coach. The police drove that coach through crowds of people sitting down in the street trying to block the way for that coach. Then after that had happened, the meeting went ahead, and then the police, in essence, dispersed protesters from outside the vicinity of where the meeting had taken place. They did so using extraordinary violence. By any... someone said earlier that violence was unprecedented. I wouldn't go that far. Anyone who knows the story of the 1970s knows there were a lot of incidents where people were protesting against the National Front, and there were a lot of incidents where violence was used. At Lewisham, for example, 3 years before, the police had used riot shields for the first time on the mainland. So there was a process of violence that built up to it. But the violence on the day was still, by any measure, further and greater than anything that had gone before. We've heard some examples of it through the course of today. People have talked about Clarence Baker, the manager of Misty and Roots, who was struck on the head while he was in the People's Unity building, struck on the head and was in hospital for several months afterwards. The example I always use is, again, from the same building, People's Unite headquarters, which had become, in effect, the headquarters of the demonstrators on the day. It had a number of lawyers in there who were trying desperately to give legal assistance to the people who were under attack by the police, and a number of nurses and doctors. Almost every single medical professional who was in that building was himself struck on the head. And there are reports of nurses, I'm talking about nurses in full nurses' uniforms, so there's no mystery about who they were, being knocked unconscious by police batons, and doctors again being struck in very similar terms. As for Blair Peach and his friends, they'd tried, and they'd been part of the crowd which tried to block the way for the coach to get into this National Front election rally. The police were then dispersing them. Blair Peach himself was literally running away from the police on Beechcroft Avenue when he was struck on the back of his head and killed. One of the things which was remarkable or noticed about the way in which he died was that, and something which was important in the legal process, was that he'd been killed by a wound which was powerful enough to kill him, but not so powerful as to actually break the skin on his head. And this was something which was quite extraordinary. And that meant, in effect, that the police must have been, whichever police officer it was, must have been using some sort of unofficial weapon. You couldn't do that with an ordinary police baton. So one of the things which happened just in the days immediately after the police riot is that the police investigation, because there was a police investigation into the murder, went through and they tried to identify the officers concerned. They did that by looking at the weapons which had been used, and they raided the lockers of the police officers concerned. They found a leather-covered stick, 2 knives, a large truncheon, a crowbar, a metal cosh, a whip handle, 26 weapons of that sort altogether, which the six police officers from the unit of the Special Patrol Group who'd been there had been hoarding to use when they attacked demonstrations or they attacked individuals. So there was an inquest into Blair Peach's killing, and inquests are important in our legal system. Inquests are, in effect, the starting point of a criminal trial. If an inquest hears a case and decides that there has been an unlawful killing, that, in effect, is a recommendation there should be a trial of the person who carried out the killing. Unfortunately, the coroner chosen to conduct the inquest, a man called John Burton, decided right from the start of the process that his job was to make sure that no findings were made which were negative to the police. And I'll just list two or three things, two or three decisions he made, which guaranteed that would happen. The first was he tried very hard to make sure that it was an inquest without a jury, so that he would be the only person taking all the decisions. Now, Blair Peach's family lawyers were able to defeat that and were able to appeal that decision and get the Court of Appeal to insist there had to be a jury. But that was part of the process of him wanting to make sure he could control the whole process. The second thing John Burton did is he said that after weeks in which the jury had heard all these different accounts from all these police officers of what they'd seen, of the vast numbers of local witnesses who'd seen Blair Peach's killing. At the end of it, he summed up and he said to the jury, in effect, that they must not find unlawful killing. He said that was an extreme theory, and in essence, it was something that would be unacceptable. They would not be doing their job as jurors if they found that. The last thing he did, and this perhaps is actually the most important, is he kept back from the jury the results of the police investigation into Blair Peach's death. As I've already indicated, when a police officer kills someone, as with anyone else, the police investigate. The police had, in fact, identified a prime suspect and had a very large number of detailed reasons for believing he was the prime suspect. The most important were, in essence, and he was the officer in charge of this SPG group, in essence it came out that he'd been organising them to lie to the police officer carrying out the investigation to present a shared and untrue version of events, that they hadn't been in the scene of Blair Peach's killing, whereas in fact their car had stopped immediately beside him moments before he was killed, and to pretend that other police officers had been at the site when actually they hadn't been. The police, taking up a vast amount of resources, were able to show that each of these were lies and show that there'd been a process of orchestrated lying, which, for the police officers concerned, made it seem very likely to them that they'd identified the killers, or the killer. Unfortunately, all of this was kept back from the inquest. The lawyers representing Blair Peach's family had no knowledge of this information, and they weren't able to put this information to the police officers on the stand. So the police officers were, in effect, able to just deny everything, say, I don't remember, I don't know, it's very difficult, it's weeks ago, how am I supposed to know what happened? And just deny and stonewall with the coroner the whole way through, remarking on what wonderful, reliable, important people they were, and telling the jury repeatedly that above all the police had to be vindicated. Now, I've gone through this in a lot of detail because I don't just want to focus on what happened to Blair Peach, but also to talk, as I say, about what would justice mean for Blair Peach. And I want to go through really two core possibilities which have been discussed by activists and those who care about the past for some time now. The first idea that we had for a long time was that it might be appropriate to call for a second inquest into Blair Peach's death. And the thinking here was really based on, for those people, many people in the room will have seen what happened with the Hillsborough inquest, that it became clear that the information presented to the jury in that case hadn't been the whole truth, that key documents had been kept back. And so on that basis, an application was made to the High Court for a fresh inquest. And you can have a second inquest where key information has been held back. So they applied to the High Court for further inquest. That inquest found unlawful killing, and the result has been the prosecution of the police officers concerned. I do want to say that although there are some advantages with the inquest model, it's clear, it's precise, it's a very clear procedure to be followed. There are a number of disadvantages, and I'm just going to mention two. The first one is it is extremely slow. If you think about Hillsborough, between, in a sense, the collective moment of realisation that key documents have been held back, let's be honest, most people have got to that by the early 1990s, and it's 2019. even if you just think about the legal processes, applying to the High Court, then a second inquest, then a criminal trial, each of these could take 3-5 years. And what that means in all of them is, in essence, you're putting an enormous amount of pressure on a very small number of individuals. In effect, the family members of the dead, who have to lead the whole way through the process. They have to instruct lawyers, and they have to do it daily. They have to be in charge of it. And that's an enormous burden to put on anyone. So there are advantages with an inquest, but there are disadvantages. I'll mention another one. In an inquest process, everything is about how someone died. Who died? How did they die? Who's at fault for death? It all becomes, can we get a conviction for murder? Now, that might not be actually politically the most important thing, or it might not be the only thing. I'll come now to talk about the difference between an inquest and a public inquiry. And the model I've got here is another set of campaigns I'm very involved with as a barrister, is a campaign against the blacklisting of construction workers, which was revealed 10.5 years ago. We found there'd been this mass conspiracy to keep back from the public that the employers were sharing information about construction workers and keeping them from employment. There, the campaign's focused on calling for a public inquiry, and the Labour Party's agreed that if the Labour Party wins the next election, and, you know, they're ahead in the polls, it's not impossible, the Labour Party has agreed that there will be a public inquiry into blacklisting if they're elected, and they've said it so many times now, they couldn't pull out of that. There are a number of advantages of campaigning for a public inquiry. The first is that it is solely a political decision. With an inquest, it's a judicial decision. Can we go to the High Court? Can we persuade a High Court judge there needs to be a fresh inquest? It's a judicial decision. It's not in our control. The decision to call an inquiry or not is a political decision. To that extent, it's in our control. Another important thing about an inquiry is it doesn't just have to be about a single death, but it can be about a whole sequence of events. A day which ended with 700 people arrested, 345 people on trial. The extraordinary police violence that was used on that occasion. You could use a public inquiry to say today, what would happen if there was a similar process whereby a tiny number of racists wanted to have a political meeting inside a black community to offend and harass the black people there? Would they be able to stop it? How could we stop it? Those could be issues you could bring to a public inquiry. Another issue you could bring to a public inquiry, which is just as relevant today, is about the use of force by police officers. It's absolutely clear with Southall in 1979 that someone authorised the use of batons against people's heads on that scale. Well, again, we can say, how can we make sure that that could absolutely never happen again? We could also use a public inquiry, it seems to me, to raise the question of racism. A key argument used by John Burton to say that the eyewitnesses to Blair Peach's killing couldn't be believed, he said this expressly. He said there are two categories of witnesses. One were children, well, you can't believe children, and the other were people who hadn't been born in Britain. By definition, anyone who hadn't been born in Britain, or was descended from people who couldn't be born in Britain, could not be a witness on an equal standing to a white person in a British court because they were unfamiliar with the British justice system and therefore could not be believed. Now, this may be understood now as a particularly grotesque form of racism, but as a barrister who deals with equality and discrimination issues quite a lot in my day-to-day practice, I assure you that was not the last occasion that we've had to deal with racism in British courts. So once again, there are things that could be done with an inquiry that would go further with an inquest. Really, I just want to leave it there. I am not saying that any process will be easy. That would be ridiculous. You know, this is some time after the events. Any effective public inquiry, for example, would have to be absolutely sure that there were a large number of people willing to come forward and testify as to what happened at Southall in 1979. But there is a process by which we could obtain justice for Blair Peach, and by which we could also, as I say, put his death in the right context, to portray Blair Peach as he saw himself, not as a saviour, but as an equal, and someone who's part of this longer story of racism and police violence.